In this podcast episode, Andrew Bustamante delves into the complexities of current U.S. foreign policy under Donald Trump, focusing primarily on the ongoing tensions with Iran and the broader implications for the Middle East. The conversation explores the strategic motives behind U.S. actions, the challenges of intelligence and misinformation surrounding Iran's nuclear program, the economic and political undercurrents influencing decisions, and the uncertain future of American global power and domestic unity. Bustamante also discusses systemic issues such as economic instability, populism, and the role of wealth and innovation in shaping the national and global landscape. Bustamante opens by analyzing recent U.S.-Iran military interactions, including the downing of an Apache helicopter by Iranian forces despite claims that Iran had been totally destroyed. He highlights the complexities and uncertainties surrounding such events, suggesting that some attacks may be accidental or miscalculated rather than intentional provocations. The discussion points out that Iran's military capabilities are often underestimated or misrepresented, and that U.S. responses, especially public declarations by Trump, may not align with the on-the-ground realities. The strategic ambiguity around these military incidents fuels ongoing tensions, but also signals a larger pattern of overshoot in the U.S.'s limited war efforts. Rather than viewing Iran solely as a destabilizing force to be eliminated, Bustamante argues that Iran's role as a threat in the Middle East serves certain strategic interests for the United States. By maintaining a balance of power where Sunni U.S. allies, such as Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Israel depend on American military support and arms sales, Washington perpetuates a revenue stream vital to the military-industrial complex. This dynamic creates ongoing instability that sustains U.S. influence and defense commitments across the region, even if it complicates broader peace efforts. Despite public narratives that Trump desires peace, Bustamante contends that Trump's administration seeks leverage rather than genuine resolution with Iran. The idea is to pressure Iran politically and militarily while preserving enough conflict to keep U.S. regional allies reliant on American power. Another motivating factor is Trump's pursuit of a legacy defined by decisive action and demonstrating strength by confronting long-standing U.S. adversaries like Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, and Iran. The podcast explains that even if Trump's tactics appear inconsistent or erratic, they align with a broader ambition to position himself as a strongman leader capable of reshaping global politics within a limited time frame. Bustamante illustrates the limitations of U.S. policy toward Iran, including unsuccessful attempts to assassinate key Iranian leadership and the inability to dismantle Iran's influence over crucial strategic assets like the Strait of Hormuz. He notes the complexities added by Iran's network of proxies and regional partners, making the conflict multifaceted and protracted. Moreover, the episode suggests that U.S. intelligence about Iran is often incomplete or clouded by misinformation, which hampers effective decision-making and contributes to overextension in U.S. commitments without a clear exit strategy. The conversation critically examines the narrative around Iran's nuclear ambitions, labeling the commonly portrayed threat as a mixture of propaganda, misunderstanding, and incomplete information. According to Bustamante, official reports indicate the Iranian nuclear program was largely eradicated by mid-2025, yet contradictory messages persist. He emphasizes the difference between possessing enriched uranium, having a deployable nuclear weapon, and possessing credible delivery systems, highlighting that these distinctions are often blurred in public discourse. Bustamante posits that any real nuclear threat likely involves indirect pathways, such as technology transfers from allies like China or Russia, rather than Iran's indigenous capabilities alone. The podcast reviews the repeated U.S. engagement in limited wars, citing Vietnam and Afghanistan as historical examples of failures in such conflict strategies. Bustamante explains that the current Iran conflict represents an overshoot, where resources committed exceed the actual capacity to achieve stated objectives. This overcommitment creates a no-win scenario in which the U.S. risks prolonged involvement without decisive outcomes while straining both military and political capital. The episode stresses that such failures diminish U.S. credibility among allies and adversaries alike. Bustamante explores the fracturing of trust between the U.S. and its coalition partners, both in the Middle East and globally. He points to indications, such as the UAE's changing posture and Saudi Arabia's cautious engagement with U.S. policies, as evidence of waning confidence in American reliability. Allies increasingly question whether the U.S. has the capacity or willingness to fulfill security commitments, driving some to diversify their own strategies or hedge their bets. This trend threatens to weaken U.S. influence and aid adversarial powers in reshaping regional dynamics. A major theme involves the interplay between the military-industrial complex and the financial-industrial technological complex, as articulated through a conversation about wealth, global investment flows, and geopolitical maneuvering. Bustamante and the host discuss how elite investors manage risk by diversifying portfolios across borders, often independent of nationalistic or ideological loyalties. The podcast argues that political actions, including conflicts like those with Iran, are partially driven by financial incentives tied to arms sales, technology investments, and broader resource control. This financialization shapes not only policies but also the narratives presented to the public. The episode offers a perspective that the public political conflicts, such as Trump's confrontations with Iran or alliances with Netanyahu, may function partly as a puppet show, masking deeper financial agendas and shifts in global power. The complexity and opacity of global finance, investment, and influence often dwarf the apparent political battles, suggesting that public leaders like Trump are navigating within a web of influences they themselves do not fully control. Bustamante addresses the difficulties of forecasting the future given the unprecedented speed and volume of technological, economic, and social change, compounded by systemic interdependence. He compares the current U.S. situation to historical empires like the Soviet Union and Ottoman Empire on the brink of collapse, warning that while a similar decline is possible, it is not predetermined. The sheer complexity and the pervasive misinformation environments render traditional analytical tools less effective, requiring a new approach to understanding global dynamics. Turning inward, the conversation highlights America's intense political polarization and the rise of populism as symptoms of deeper economic and social malaise. Bustamante articulates how economic uncertainty fosters fear, tribalism, and the elevation of strongman figures who promise safety and order. The discussion acknowledges the dangers of extremist politics on both left and right, and the challenge posed by a citizenry increasingly divided and distrustful of democratic processes, threatening effective governance and social cohesion. Bustamante stresses the centrality of a thriving middle class as the backbone of a healthy economy and democracy. He laments the growing wealth disparity where a small percentage controls the majority of assets, undermining economic mobility and broad-based prosperity. The podcast discusses the importance of economic literacy among politicians and voters and reflects on historical examples such as Margaret Thatcher's reforms to stabilize the British economy. It suggests that meaningful recovery requires tough fiscal discipline and alignment of voter interests with sustainable economic policies. A key insight revolves around the idea that voters should focus not only on immediate grievances, but on the vision for the nation's future when choosing political representatives. Bustamante laments the shortage of leaders offering long-term constructive visions and the prevalence of rhetorical attacks centered on the present. He urges voters to engage more deeply with candidates' plans and to demand accountability in economic competence and policy foresight. The episode discusses the transformative potential of technological innovation, especially artificial intelligence, in reshaping economic prospects. While acknowledging short-term disruptions and investment risks, Bustamante remains optimistic about AI's capacity to drive efficiency, create new jobs, and foster an age of relative abundance. He points out the necessity of embracing innovation to address systemic financial challenges and to enable economic growth sufficient to offset debt burdens. A significant portion of the discussion centers on individual agency in navigating economic uncertainty. Bustamante encourages listeners to engage in wealth-building strategies, emphasizing that investing and financial literacy are crucial tools to secure personal futures amidst broader systemic instability. He advocates for proactive learning and taking concrete steps toward financial independence as a complement to civic engagement. Finally, the podcast touches on practical considerations in anticipation of possible societal upheavals or economic implosions. Bustamante shares his personal plans for safeguarding family and wealth, acknowledging the seriousness of current trends, while maintaining a cautious hope that voices advocating reform and intelligence can grow. The need to stay informed, be adaptable, and build resilience emerges as the prudent path forward in an unpredictable world.